Welcome to Jerusalem Unplugged, the only podcast dedicated to Jerusalem, its history, and its people. Your host, Roberto Mazza, will bring you guests discussing their relationship with the Holy City. A journey through history, society, feelings, and hopes for the future. Follow the podcast on all social media platforms at Jerusalem Unplugged.
Welcome to Jerusalem Unplugged, the podcast dedicated to Jerusalem, its history, and its people. I'm your host, Roberto Mazza, and today it's my great pleasure to host Merav Mack. Merav is currently affiliated with the Johannes Gutenberg University of Mainz, and he is the author of a number of works, particularly about religious relations in Jerusalem in the medieval times, but more importantly, recently with Benjamin Balint, she published a fascinating book, Jerusalem, City of the Book, published by Yale University Press. And it's an amazing story that we will talk about, the story of the libraries of Jerusalem and how you can actually read the history of Jerusalem through the books that are in Jerusalem. But first of all, Merav, welcome.
Hello, Roberto. It's really nice to be with you today.
Merav, the first question, as usual, is what is your Jerusalem? In other words, what is your connection with the city?
Well, it's quite simple. Jerusalem is home for me. I've lived in different places in the world, but Jerusalem is home. And it's perhaps more than that. I find Jerusalem an endless source of fascination, of inspiration. There's a sense of adventure about it, which I'm sure we'll get into. But I guess it's above everything else, it's an identity. I'm a Jerusalemite. My family has lived there for hundreds of years, and I am connected to it in so many different ways.
I wanted to ask you about your experience, growing up as a Jerusalemite. Many people on the show obviously are Jerusalemites, and each and one of them brought something unique, something of a different experience. So I was just wondering about Merav growing in Jerusalem and how you feel about the city.
I think what I like mostly about Jerusalem is the sense of, it makes me a bit humble. It's a place where, on the one hand, I am from and I belong to it and I love it. But at the same time, you know how you can just cross a road and you fall immediately into an entirely new world. And there are so many such places in the city that make you feel like you're going abroad, that you're visiting somewhere else. It's not just crossing the divide between East and West Jerusalem. It's almost everywhere. It's going between the different religious communities. It's going into different, even if you step into Meravs, you cross from one kollel to another. You go behind, you know how those streets with long walls inside the old city, and sometimes you just have this urge of just knocking on the door and discovering that, on the other side, there is an entire world that you didn't know about, even though you walked there like hundreds of times. I love that sense. And I love the fact that there is so much to learn about it, that there is no one language that is enough for this city. In that sense, I feel that it's a very humbling place. And it's the same token, it's that sort of fascination and the sense of adventure. So you go into the street and you discover that it's a holiday for a community that you just didn't remember because, we have at the same time 3 different calendars going on. And beyond that, there are little calendars that each community would have. So even though I'm very acute to those ritualistic, the main calendars, then at the same time, you just still surprised by stumbling into a procession that you didn't expect when you walk in the streets. Do you know what I mean?
as I lived on and off in Jerusalem too, at some point I remember I really had to remember going, for work into different institutions, whether it was open or closed because it was a specific holiday or a particular day throughout the week. And it's something that obviously, perhaps outside Jerusalem, it's not that common. You take for granted that, it's the week is from Monday to Friday. Maybe, again, depending if you're like in Israel, for instance, obviously Shabbat, it's holiday, or if you're in the West Bank, or, obviously it's Friday. But then Jerusalem has its own calendar because it depends on the community that you belong to or you're working with. And I never thought about it, but yeah, you're absolutely right. And I see what you mean. It's like, it's also fascinating, that aspect to consider. But I also love this idea of discovery, the fact that every place you go, there's always something that you don't know about. And I was wondering if there's anything that stood out in the past few years, perhaps while you were walking around Jerusalem, and all of a sudden you made the discovery, say, you know what, I've been walking here for decades and I never thought about this, or I never saw this particularly.
I think that when you do, when you stop for a moment for an observation. I remember, for example, one day standing at Jaffa Gate. I have arranged to meet someone and I arrived about 10 minutes, maybe earlier. And it was a wonderful afternoon because there were like a lot of processions on that day, and people were walking in large groups, and each one of them had a purpose, but nobody knew about the other one. So there were Greek Orthodox coming out of the old city at the same time as Armenian were walking in procession into the city. There were some Jews walking in large numbers, and the scouts were marching as well. And each one was like doing their own thing without thinking about the others. But it was just wonderful. And I remember years later when I was teaching a course at the Hebrew University, I sent my students to various points. They had a little mission of going to document a holy site, or another option, they were allowed to choose a ritual that they were going to observe. And I asked them to document what they were looking at. And after looking at it from the main perspective that they were asking themselves or that they were going to discover, I asked them to then turn around and cross the street and go and talk to people on the other side. So, for example, if they were documenting a Christian ritual, to then go and talk to a Muslim passerby or a shopkeeper or a Jewish person, ask them how they feel about it, what they thought about what was going on, to just get the other perspective. And it was a fantastic exercise because you get so many views about the same situation, about the same place. And I think that's part of the layering understanding of how deep this city goes, that you can explore it forever. And but you're asking me about specific discoveries, and I think I can remember quite a few moments of discoveries. The first time you go into a library that you've been hearing about and never been able to access. For me, that was just utterly amazing. Being taken around the Armenian Centauros library. This is one of the, this is a manuscript library inside the Armenian Quarter, which is not only closed for the public, for the world, but even for the Armenian community. It's just always closed, and it opens only for just one day a year for a religious ritual. And unless you have a very special reason to visit it, it's just locked.
I hope one day our common friend George Intlian will allow me to visit that place, which always promises me to do, but it never happens. I wanted to ask you something about your work. You, by definition, are a medievalist. And in your bio, I mean, anybody can read that your PhD thesis was on Genoa, the city of Genoa in northern Italy, at the time of the Crusades. So I think it's kind of natural to think about how did you end up working on Jerusalem?
That's a great question. I did start as my academic career as a medievalist, and in fact, nowadays, maybe I will talk about it later, I'm going back into more work into medieval history. But I think that the two things were connected. I mean, my interest in history started when I was 14. I remember my parents took me on an academic course. We lived in Jerusalem. I grew up in West Jerusalem, and they took me on an academic course of 3 days exploring medieval Jerusalem. It was led by the late Professor Joshua Prava, that everyone in the field of Crusader studies has heard of. He's very legendary professor of Crusader studies, and he took us around Jerusalem. I just immediately fell in love with the city in a way that I didn't expect, because I grew up there and I walked in those streets forever, but suddenly I went into places that I've never been to before. This was the first time I visited the Church of the Holy Sepulchre. It was the first time I went into the Church of the Nativity in Bethlehem. It took us, of course, to Abu Ghosh and to so many different places. But so it was that sort of moment when I thought, oh, I'd love to learn more about this period in the history of Jerusalem. And I thought it was just amazing that there were so many buildings that I could look at, that they were actually there from the time of the Crusades. And the city itself actually hasn't changed that much, not in size, not in its layout. Main streets, the main corridors, the main, even the buildings, they're all still there. And so that was my first fascination with the Crusades. And years later, I explored more other aspects, Italian communities in the Holy Land during the Middle Ages. The Genoese, as you said, that was my PhD project, which I totally loved, because I was following the sort of people that nobody was interested in examining at the time of the Crusade. It was not about the heroes of the Crusade, the period, the fighters, the kings. It was merchants. Nobody looks at merchants. And I found them fascinating. And, the people that go in between, that communicate with everyone. And to a large degree, I think that my interest in looking at the kind of like standing on the borderline between communities, looking at the perspective of, for many years, I've been exploring the Christian communities in Jerusalem. That's exactly this sort of aspect. It's not looking at it from the perspective of the national divides, the big stories that everyone else is looking into, but actually looking at from a perspective of the smaller communities. So those merchants led me straight into discovering the Christian communities, and ultimately back into the streets of Jerusalem.
I suppose there's a general, I don't want to say ignorance, but lack of knowledge about the fact that European cities, particularly around the period of time, and mainly Italian port cities, had this very strong connection with what was known as the Holy Lands, through trade and commerce, not just through conquest and military adventures. Even the way Italian history is taught, and as an Italian, I can certainly say that is not really highlighted. Normally, the medieval times go from the Dark Ages and then obviously through the Italian republics. But there's a lot more attention, for instance, around the Silk Road than the connection with Palestine, which I personally believe was stronger and even in terms of legacy, long-lasting. I mean, think about the buildings. Sometimes when I go around Israel or the West Bank in Palestine, and you see certain names that obviously are reminiscence of, not just the Crusader, but also by names, you can make connections with places that I'm familiar with. I wanted to ask you something because you talked about, your interest for religious communities and particularly with the Christians. And I remember it was just about 4 years ago, an exhibition at the Metropolitan Museums in New York, which was called Jerusalem 1000 to 1400, Every People Under Heaven. And I remember I just had the chance to briefly visit that exhibition. And one of the interesting aspects, it was that the whole idea was that people of Jerusalem, regardless of their religious affiliations, but they shared this idea of heaven somehow. And most of that was about books and manuscripts, obviously. And so that brings us to your new book, your new work. Ideally, how did you come about the idea of writing a history of Jerusalem through books and an history of libraries of Jerusalem and in Jerusalem?
So the libraries of Jerusalem, first of all, maybe I should say that I agree with you that I think the exhibition at the Metropolitan Museum was absolutely outstanding and very much a source of inspiration. The curators were working on their project right as I was working on this book, on the City of the Book. And we met many times, both in Jerusalem and in New York. I contributed a little bit to this exhibition as well. But the project itself, the library project, came to me when the first time that I actually asked to do a survey. I wanted to find out, this was a little bit funny because I remember vividly thinking that we really ought to find a way of digitizing all the secret archives and libraries and make them available and create perhaps a joint library for the whole of Jerusalem. This was back in 2006, 2007. And I remember going to the funders and telling them, I'll probably need something like 3 months to go around and survey the libraries, just to find out what exists, if they need any help, and how to go about it. And little did I know that this project will just be a beginning of a long, many-year project of exploring libraries. Not only that the majority were not interested in digitizing anything, they didn't even want me to go in. And I was totally baffled by this at the beginning. But I think later on that became the whole project. It was infuriating at the beginning because I couldn't understand why. Why wouldn't you let me into your library? I knew some of them before. I was already friends with the person who was at the time the librarian of the Greek Orthodox Library, Archbishop Aristarchos, who is today the Secretary General of the Greek Orthodox Library, the Greek Orthodox Patriarchate. So he took me in a few times into the amazing Greek Orthodox library, but I couldn't understand why others kept their doors so firmly closed, and what was a big secret and what was a big problem. And I found that so infuriating at the time that I wanted to understand it, and that became the mission partly for the book. And later on it changed, because one of the interesting or funny turns of this project was when I realized that actually those guardians, those custodians of libraries, had a completely different understanding or concept of a library than I was thinking about. You and I and all of our friends who are historians are used to thinking about libraries as places that librarians would invite you in, would help you to find what you're looking for, would be interested in your project, would be maybe even dedicating a bit of time to do a little search with you. And here I came across something that, again, I mean, it's not entirely unusual. We know that in quite a few places, but where the librarians are more of guardians. They are suspicious of people who come in, and perhaps rightfully so. I think the wonderful moment of realizing that these custodians, they are there to protect the books. They're not there to help me or any other scholar. They're there to protect this heritage. And it's a completely different task than what I was thinking about. And gradually, I realized that those custodians are at least as interesting figures to understand as the books that they are guarding. And to a large degree, I think that City of the Book is about them, and not just about Jerusalem and not just about libraries.
There's a very challenging chapter, I would say, in the book, which is about rescue and return, which also is a reminder of the fact that libraries suffered the consequences of war, particularly in 1948. And I was wondering to what extent this event, and perhaps also 1967, may have created that sense of suspicious, of the idea, to be closed instead of to be outward and open the doors of their libraries.
Absolutely. I think that the sense of losing your books, of losing your connection to your heritage, losing your identity. The books are so much part of our life and our understanding of who we are. If I could just find the words of Sakakini, where he writes about his own library, about farewell to my library, when he left Jerusalem, when he had to flee and had to leave the library behind. What a horrible moment in one's life. I think there are very little things that people are as connected to as their books. And here you're absolutely right. It's the different notions of why those books are so important to people. I think I find extremely interesting, and the loss of or what might lead to a loss is definitely one of them. And it's not just 48 or 67. I remember one day I was talking to one of the Greek Orthodox leading scholars, and I asked him about the library closing to scholars for a while. I mean, they were doing some renovations, but there were repeated stories about not giving access to scholars. And I asked him, what is it about the library that you don't want people to get into? What's the problem? And he said one word. He said, Uspensky. And I thought, Uspensky? who is Ouspensky? I've never heard that name before. Is it someone I know? And he laughed and he said, no, this is someone from the 19th century. And so I did my little research about him and found that Bishop Porfiry Ouspensky was the first to be sent on a mission from Russia to the Holy Land, to the Greek Orthodox Patriarchate. But he ended up being one of the people who were trusted and then betrayed that trust and stole from the library. I remember finding a little in the National Library of Russia, there's a webpage about him, and there's a little quote where he says about himself, let me see if I can find it for you. He says, he compares himself to a bee, and he says, why do I walk the earth so long to bring, like a bee, beautiful honey to my hive? I'm God's bee and Russia is my hive. And this is his justification for spiriting off books, manuscripts from Jerusalem, from MaSabha monastery, from Sinai, from many other places that he visited, and taking them back to Russia. And he was not the only one. The 19th century discoveries of the manuscript libraries throughout the Middle East were a time when books had been stolen frequently from many of those institutions. So there's no wonder that there is need for the sense of protection, for taking special care of those treasures. At the same time as growing understanding that these treasures need to be also shared with the world. And I think throughout Jerusalem, which I find a great sense of change when it comes to the libraries, more openness to digitizing material, to making them available, even across very sensitive political issues. AP manuscripts, which are the property that was, for example, that you mentioned earlier, the 48 books, and including some manuscripts that were taken from houses that are now kept at the National Library of Israel, are gradually becoming available online. Even in places where, for example, in 2007, when I first went to visit the ultra-Orthodox archives, and their first reaction was absolutely never going to digitize anything because the internet is a terrible place. Or the whole idea of the internet is against our belief system, they were telling me. Not everyone, of course, but almost everyone. Nowadays, making things available online. So a lot has changed over the years. And I think we can find more and more material available. And it's also, I think, the understanding that this is another way of actually safeguarding the treasures is to also have a copy, have a digital copy, and is another way of achieving the same goal of protection.
Love this podcast? Support this show through the Acast supporter feature. It's up to you how much you give, and there's no regular commitment. Just hit the link in the show description to support now.
You made me think about a passage in The Name of a Rose by Umberto Eco, and I forgot the name of the main character, but played by Sean Connery in the movie, when in the middle of a fire, he's trying to save the books. And the whole point is about preserving the heritage against all the odds, whether it's war, fire, or natural disaster. I wanted to ask you something. You worked in a number of libraries in Jerusalem, and you talked about the question of access. I was wondering if gender might have been a problem given that you had to deal with religious communities, and some of these religious communities do have a, shall we say, distrust of women?
That's really fun that you're asking me this question, because I was thinking about it earlier today. I remember when I first started, the whole idea of doing a survey of the libraries and archives of Jerusalem, I did what I normally do in such cases when I start a new project, and I went to meet people and ask for their advice. And there's one person that I loved very dearly, and I often went to visit her. This was Sister Abraham. I don't know if you had the chance to meet her, probably not. She used to live on the Mount of Olives at the Benedictine nunnery. Even though she was not a Benedictine nun herself, she belonged to the Ethiopian church, and she was a woman who spoke, I don't know how many languages, but something like 15 maybe, known as Sister Abraham. She wrote the history of the Ethiopian community in Jerusalem. She wrote a lot about various aspects of life in the city. And she told me in that meeting, she said, you know, it's not going to work. They'll never let you in, not to any of the important libraries. And she said, it's not because you come from Jewish family, it's not because you are, and it's not because you are an Israeli, it's because you're a woman. And she was absolutely sure that I'd never managed to do any of what I was set to do. And I'm very lucky that she was wrong. It doesn't mean that it's easy, and it remains difficult, because my current project, I'm going to go back into all these same libraries for a new project that we'll probably talk about in a few minutes. But it is difficult, but it's not impossible. And what I actually discovered, that part of the difficulty was my own biases. I'll give you an example. In the original survey, I kept the ultra-Orthodox communities to the very last. I approached absolutely everyone else, and I thought they will never meet me. They will never let me into their communities. And I was totally wrong. I walked on the door, and when I arranged a meeting, I walked in. Well, I was dressed up modestly, but I do anyway, and I do that when I go for meetings with the WAF. So it's not a big deal. I walked. I dressed up in long skirt and went to see the rabbis in Mea Shearim, and they were incredibly nice and incredibly open to preserving and protecting their heritage. They didn't like the idea of the internet back then, but as I said, even that has changed since. But it was my own biases that made me think that they would not let me in. So this is just one example. In other places, I came across a lot of different obstacles. But I can give you another example. With the Syriac community, I found it very, very difficult to get access. I'm not the first one. I'm not the only one. People were reporting about it in their academic articles for many years. But I think the moment that I realized that it was not about me, and it was not even about such big fears of theft in that particular case, but when Abuna Shimon, for the first time, when I first realized that what actually drove him to not let me in was a sense of shame. He was simply ashamed about the state of his manuscript. And, when you start realizing how wrong was my own perception of what motivated him or motivates people in general, then you begin to understand the city and its complexities, because it's so much more complex.
And this is where I wanted really to go. I think I mentioned before the interview to you that I was blown away by your book, because in a sense, it's not only about the period of time that you cover, which also goes up to the modern era, but certainly covers the very beginning, also the early and later medieval periods of the city. But I was fascinated by the idea of reading the history of Jerusalem through these institutions. And so I was wondering, what is that we can learn about Jerusalem looking at the libraries in the city and their history?
So this is quite a big question. I mean, I think it's easier to think about what can we learn about it through the eyes of particular people. And I can again draw us into examples. For some reason, I'm thinking of one of the most wonderful librarians in the city, Dr. Salame, who is nowadays in charge of the Khalidi Library. But previously, he was the director of the Al-Aqsa Mosque Museum and Library. And it was through him that, I first tried to work out what it meant for people to become even librarians and to become those custodians of knowledge and books and manuscripts. And I remember I asked him once to take us on a tour. It was my co-writer, the wonderful Ben Balint, and I and Khada. We got into the car and we drove first to the village where he was born, Zakaria. Today it's called Moshav Zecharia, and where he showed us around the village and told us the story of the Nakba as he experienced it. And from there we drove all the way over to the Dahesh refugee camp where he grew up. And I just wanted to understand how someone grows up in a refugee camp and becomes a librarian and ends up being a protector of such of the written heritage. And it was piecing it together. He had a great passion to inscriptions and to piecing broken inscriptions together. And seeing him do this work, I felt that we are beginning, that I can almost touch what it means to be a Jerusalemite, or putting together those broken inscriptions and putting together that history that people don't usually tell. And that's what I find so attractive and so interesting in exploring libraries, because you find a completely different story about relationship between individuals and between communities when you look into the medieval, for example, libraries of Jerusalem. My current project, as I said, it really started when I was working on the libraries. At some point, I started looking for medieval, not just medieval actually, but books that were written in Jerusalem in particular. So visiting those libraries, I wanted to know what was created in the city and what we can touch that was actually born and thought about and imagined and produced in the city. So this book production, and I was very much surprised, because I knew from my work on Crusader Jerusalem or medieval period of Jerusalem, I knew of some manuscripts. You saw them at the, or some of the most beautiful ones at the exhibition at the Metropolitan. But I started listing them and trying to put them together partially because I'm now planning to have, with the National Library of Israel, we're going to have an exhibition in 2024 on the libraries of Jerusalem, and we thought that we will focus specifically on those manuscripts that were written in Jerusalem. And then you discover how many we actually have, many more than I have ever imagined. When I started thinking about it, I had listed maybe 20, 30 manuscripts that I had in mind. And those numbers have doubled and doubled and doubled. And now my lists are coming up to 300, 400, just for the period of medieval period, from 900 to 1500. So going from the Abbasid period through the Frankish Kingdom of Jerusalem into, I don't have much from Ayyubid Jerusalem, but Mamluk Jerusalem. We have an exceptional number of manuscripts, and the link between them is what I'm fascinated by, because take, for example, the Abbasid period, when not just Muslims immigrated into the city and produced and brought in new way of thinking and writing and new language, and everyone was, Arabic was introduced to the community and adopted by the local community, and suddenly we have local Christians and then Jews adopting Arabic as their language as well, and going through translation projects. It's just utterly fascinating to see that they translate similar texts, biblical texts, at the same time. How language plays a huge part of people's life in the city, and how much more interconnected it was. I think, and I wonder if you'd agree with me, because I think that we quite often project ideas from what we see in the reality of Jerusalem today, and we think, oh, that might have been the same in the past. And I'm not sure. I don't know how disconnected were the communities in medieval Jerusalem. I'm beginning to suspect that much less than we might have assumed, but I'm not entirely sure.
One thing that comes across your book, and again, this is my reading, despite the obvious disruptions brought about the change in administrations, which also meant obviously warfare and massacres and killings, but effectively it feels like certain aspects of cultural life within Jerusalem, from the Byzantine to the Abbasids and the Crusaders, and then again Islamic rule and so forth, there's a sense of continuity. People change language indeed from Greek to Arabic, but quite interestingly, in the Crusader period, the essentially Arabic kept to be sort of the educated language. Obviously, we can add, some sort of a European Frankish language for a short period of time, but it feels like that despite the disruptions of life, there is the sense of a cultural element that it's basically that it keeps going. And I don't know if it's a misreading or if it's also what you argue in the book.
You're right, actually. I think that culturally, there's a very deep culture that goes beyond those temporal disruptions, being national wars or earthquakes or disasters of different kinds. There is something deeper in the city that remains, and it just needs to be explored. And of course, there are times there were times in history where culture had much more prominence, partially because it was given much more funding. Take Frankish Jerusalem. We like to take that example because it's really was a spectacular time under the rulership of someone like Queen Melisande, the most amazing woman who ruled the city, who was not everyone knows that, but she was the queen of Jerusalem for a long period of time. She was Armenian. Her mother was Armenian. Her father was Latin, and she was brought up in the Orthodox tradition. She supported and funded not just architecture, new building, new churches, but also writing and scholarship, libraries. She helped not just Latin institutions, but also the Armenians and the MaSabha monastery. So way beyond her immediate close community of the Latin community in the city, and we see that in the book production of the city at the time. So at the same time when in perhaps the most wonderful example is the Psalter that is known as the Melisande Psalter, which we're definitely going to bring to the city for this exhibition in 24. It was a Psalter written for her, and we know that not because she signed her name on it, unfortunately she didn't, but she had in the calendar of the Psalter, she had the dates of her parents' memorial days. So King Baldwin II and Morphia, the Queen of Jerusalem, and so we know it was a personal Psalter that belonged to her. But the people who were involved, there were different hands involved in the writing of the manuscript itself, and the art is entirely in the Greek Orthodox tradition. And so it really shows this fusion that existed between the communities in the cultural production of the manuscript. A similar situation we have in another manuscript that was written by an Armenian. We know that because he numbered the pages, even though it's written in Latin, he numbered the pages in Armenian letters. And at the same time, we have manuscripts produced by the Syriac community, by the Greek community. So I think by putting these together one along the other, I think we may be able to learn much more about the interaction between the people. Of course, there were no Muslims and Jews in Jerusalem at the time, but during the Frankish kingdom, but in other periods we would have them added to the story as well. So, for example, when the Crusaders conquered Jerusalem, they took hold of Jewish manuscripts that they allowed later on the Jewish community in Cairo to ransom, and so they ended up in Egypt, and you have those manuscripts circulating and telling us a story of the city, also as a story of refugees, and that was true for the Middle Ages, and as you said earlier, it's true for, sadly, it was true for the city even in the 20th century.
I'm glad you are going back to work on the medieval history of Jerusalem, because I must admit that the very little I know, it's mainly through the reading of the book by Jacob Lassner, The Medieval History of Jerusalem. I think it was the name of the book, which speaks volume about not only my probably lack of knowledge, but also the fact that when I browse libraries looking for more contemporary material about medieval Jerusalem, I feel like it's some sort of a neglected period. And I was wondering if you share the same view, and perhaps why is that scholars do not focus too much on that period of time?
Funnily enough, whenever I think about it, I think, oh, I'm stepping into a field that is probably it's probably saturated So many wonderful scholars have written about medieval Jerusalem, starting from all my professors first at the Hebrew University and then in Cambridge and in Paris, and who didn't write about Jerusalem. But at the same time, I think that there are various aspects that have, as you say, have been utterly neglected. Part of it is because, it's not like Ottoman Jerusalem. We don't have those wonderful archives that you were able to walk into and study. The archives of Jerusalem were alleged, from medieval Jerusalem, from the Crusader period, were alleged to be taken over to Damascus by Saladin, and maybe they will be discovered one day. But and some material has emerged over the years, but we don't have that at the moment. At the same time, if you take the work of archaeologist Dennis Pringle, who wrote and dedicated an entire volume just to the churches of Jerusalem, for example, going through each and every building in the city, there is still so much more to be done, because a city, as you know, at least as well as I do, is built on layers and layers and layers. And that's the idea. We have the same thing in manuscripts. We call it palimpsest. It's when you have a layer, a book that was erased, and then the same pages were used again to write a new story, a new manuscript on top of it. And when you think that the first book is disappeared, modern technology allows us to actually read and rediscover the layers below. There are a few wonderful such palimpsests in the libraries of Jerusalem until today. But the city itself is like this. And on the one hand, it's very difficult. You walk through the city and you see the layer that exists and you can visit it. But there are layers below it. And I think it was on your program that Nazmi Jube, I remember describing almost falling into such a layer that nobody has seen before, and how excited he was to discover it. Medieval Jerusalem is very much there, but it needs to be discovered. And there's much more to be done about it. It's not just the Holy Sepulchre. A lot has been written about the Church of the Holy Sepulchre alone, but there's so much more. I think the Orthodox Church alone had 14 different churches across just in the old city, and they all exist until today. So exploring them in a much more detailed way. Many of them belong to communities that have no presence today. So take the Georgian community. It was so prominent in Jerusalem all the way from the 5th century into the 17th century. They had numerous monasteries and churches. And the oldest inscription in Georgian in the world is in Jerusalem today. So we sometimes forget about those smaller communities, but they're part of the story as well. Very recently, I didn't even know that there were so many Slavic manuscripts in Jerusalem, and still are in Jerusalem. So yes, there's a lot more to discover about the medieval city through the books and through those libraries.
I never thought about these communities as belonging to Jerusalem. It's kind of like more than fascinating. It really shows the fact that we still have a very partial knowledge of a city. I was thinking about the Georgian, but often I associate the Gurji community, so the Jewish community, originally from Georgia, but never the Christian. So again, it shows the fact that there is a sort of a constant discovery of aspects of a city. And as you mentioned earlier, I mean, this is a layered up history that dates back millennia, and therefore the complexity of writing this book, which is also intertwined with the politics of the various days. And so some may appear, some may disappear. And you made me think also about places like MaSabha, which is a fascinating location just south of Jerusalem, if I remember well correctly, the directions. But it's one of those monasteries that you may have heard about it, you may have known something because someone mentioned, but often goes neglected even by tourists. And I understand the restrictions to visit the place, but still it's a fascinating location, which is also connected with the history of the city. As we reach the conclusion of the interview, Merav, I want to ask you something. Is there anything that I didn't ask, but you want to discuss?
Before we touch on that, I want to say something about MaSabha, because like you, I have special affinity to that place. It's one of the places that I love mostly. And it's a funny thing, because you asked me about being a woman and problems that I might have in getting access. Of course, MaSabha is one such example. As a woman, I cannot go into MaSabha because this is a vow that was made in the 5th century, and it's valid until today, that women will not be allowed into MaSabha monastery. But whenever I went there, I've always sat outside, and I made friends with Father Ephraim, who is one of the guardians of the monastery, and we spent many hours sitting outside and talking. On one occasion, I was allowed to go and visit some of the cells around the monastery. They used to be part of the monastery in the Middle Ages, but are not included in the enclosure today. But he took me around and we talked a lot. And I remember the day when it always begins with looking at the watch, and he's trying to calculate the time when I can come and get into the monastery, or not me, but when men can go into the monastery, when the next prayer is. There was always something about trying to calculate the time. And I asked him, why is it so complex to calculate the time? And he said, and he explained to me that in the monastery they change the time every week. So you know how we change time, like in saving time, like summer saving and light saving, and in the monastery they change it every week. And it's a place that has its own time. He says, he described how he stands at the top of the monastery and looking at the cave across, and when the sun touches the cave where Saint Sabbath used to live, then that would be the time that he would set the time again. And it was a practice that was quite common in monasteries in the Byzantine period, but it remained so in Jerusalem. And I was not in Jerusalem, in the monastery of MaSabha, and it just reminds me of how there are so many things that we take for granted, but can be unique and individual, and such as time in the monastery of MaSabha. You asked me what else there is to say. There are so many stories, there are so many people I would have liked to mention and talk about and thank, because when you go on, when you carry out projects like this, you are depending on the help and support of so many different people, and those who make the introduction, that vouch for that you would make a good introduction, that you would not harm them, that you would not represent them wrongly in the story later, and yeah, I wouldn't even know where to start. I think I have tried in the book to do right to all those people that have opened their door. In some ways, I feel that this is a bit like what you are doing in this podcast. Like, talking to people is just one of the most wonderful ways of discovering a place, and it's very similar to what I try to do in City of the Book.
This was Merav Mack, affiliated with Johannes Gutenberg University of Mainz, and together with Benjamin Balint, author of Jerusalem, City of the Book, published by Yale University Press. Merav, it's been a pleasure having you here at Jerusalem Unplugged. Thank you.
Thank you, Roberto.
Thanks for listening. If you enjoyed this episode and you'd like to support the podcast, please share it with others on social media or leave a rating and review. To catch all the latest, follow us on Instagram, Twitter, and Facebook at Jerusalem Unplugged. Thanks, and I'll see you next time.